Hello and welcome to the Great Big Indian Wellness Show presented by iGlobal. I am Bhavna Barrett and I am your host for today. And I am speaking to Dr. Ramesh Patni today, who is a theologian and psychologist at the Oxford Centre. Today we're talking about spiritual mental balance. Now, yoga and spirituality in mental health, the kind of illness to wellness yoga, these are all like it's a systematic scientific method. And that particular practice is to help the human consciousness, to get command over the mind and body, and to get what you call a coherence, an integration between the self and mind-body complex. So there's a lot of talk about yoga. Yoga is now a well-known phenomenon. It's practiced in different countries in different ways by different people. But it's really a method given by ancient Rishis to the human race, which refers to one of India's wisdom tradition, used for millions of years to study, explain, and experience the mysteries of the mind and human nature. And it has a certain method that takes one to the focus and integration of the mind for optimum healthy psychological functioning. It takes you beyond illness and into wellness. And if you've ever practiced yoga, you will know this. There is this feeling when you practice yoga that comes over you where you just feel content. So the ultimate goal of liberation is, attained by the practice of yoga. And there is no better person to talk about this really than Dr. Ramesh Patni, who is a theologian, a psychologist. He holds 3 master's degrees, has a doctorate in yoga psychology from the University of Oxford, and also tutors at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. He's also a trustee and vice president of the Chinmay Mission UK, a worldwide spiritual organization where he teaches spirituality. He's the vice president south of the Indian Forum, Britain, and has been actively involved in representing the Hindu perspective at the national level for understanding and action. And he's also recently been appointed to the Trust Board of the Hindu Education Board that advocates and facilitates the teaching of Hinduism in schools in the UK, which is really, it's a very important thing to do right now. And he works as a counselor, as like a therapist, assisting people to kind of, take control of their mental well-being, become more resilient. And he's recently been awarded an OBE for his services to interfaith and the Hindu community in the UK by Her Majesty the Queen in the New Year's Honours List, which is an incredible achievement. So congratulations, Dr. Ramesh Patni. I should say Dr. Ramesh Patni OBE, and welcome to the wellness show, to the Great Big Indian Wellness Show. We're privileged and honoured to have you with us here today. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much,
Dr. Ramesh. Yeah. You're very welcome. I think a lot of people would love to know this. This concept of spiritual mental balance. So let's start off with the first thing about spirituality. Let's begin with we have like a plan. So we're just going to talk about what is spirituality, what is yoga, and they're 2 different things, right? But they come together. So talk us through a little bit about spirituality and yoga in your words.
Okay, so there is, of course, a connection between spirituality and yoga. Spirituality can really be defined in a general way as a feeling of closeness or connectedness to the sacred. So this feeling of I am close to something, I'm connected with something which I can describe as sacred. Now, this sacred could have different meaning for different people. It is not necessarily religious, because there are different ways of looking at spirituality. You can say, I'm looking at spirituality from a religious point of view, or you can say, I'm looking at it from a humanistic point of view. So what does it mean? It means that my connection, my closeness is through this human spirit, and that becomes spirituality. Or you can say, it is my connection with the sacred through a religious framework. Then it becomes religious spirituality. Or you can even say that spirituality to me is about going out in nature, being with nature, and I feel this connectedness and this closeness with nature. And it gives me a sense of calmness and peace, and that promotes a certain kind of well-being within myself. You can go even further and say, actually, I have this feeling of closeness with the universal cosmic spirit, as it were, which then becomes my connectedness to that cosmic sacredness. So there are various different ways of looking at spirituality. And of course, religion, we can say, is a specific way of looking at spirituality, so that it can be defined as a adherence to a specific belief system and practices which go with that. And there is a kind of agreement in that group of people who say, this is what we believe in, this is what we practice, this is what we call Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity, and therefore there is a kind of consensus about what constitutes the belief system, and also what constitutes the practice within that religious framework. So basically, these are kind of ways of understanding spirituality and religion. And of course, when we talk about yoga, we are talking about religious spirituality, because yoga, of course, we know is one of the classical traditions of Hinduism. And this kind of takes us into thinking about, okay, what is yoga talking about in the relationship to spirituality? And like you mentioned, is that we are talking about a certain higher state of consciousness. And that higher state of consciousness is a transcendent state of consciousness which we arrive at through the practice of the yogic techniques. And that takes us into a state of enlightenment. What we call the state of enlightenment in yoga is called kaivalya, where one is going beyond the ordinary experience to a super transcendental experience, which takes you beyond anything one can experience in the normal sense of our conscious living. And like you also mentioned, that this is a very ancient form of practice which focuses on various different things and various dimensions of our being. And it's very much a holistic system which takes care of not only your transactional life in terms of what do I do in my life in regard to my surroundings and the people around me. It also takes care of your physical being. It takes care of your mental being. And of course, the spiritual goal is also available through the yogic techniques. And the other thing which I should mention is that really the goal of yoga is what? The goal is really not about getting flexibility in the body or, using breathing techniques to calm the mind down. It has got a much higher kind of goal in that sense, is that it is about enlightenment, and it is about attaining this transcendental state of consciousness. And we have got many different, traditions of yoga itself. So starting from the classical yoga of Patanjali, we then have developments of that yoga in terms of Hatha yoga. We have got mantra yoga, we've got Kundalini yoga, Bhakti yoga, Karma yoga, Jnana yoga, and of course, Patanjali's Ashtanga yoga. So there are many different traditions of yoga itself. And, some of the modern kind of traditions which are being used very much kind of focus on the mind and also the body, primarily the body, because it's about the fitness of the body and the flexibility of the body, which then becomes a way in which many people think of yoga. Mm-hmm. But certainly that it is a spiritual solution to physical and mental problems as well. Okay. So in a wider sense, we can think about yoga as a very holistic system which orients you towards taking care of all the dimensions of your life, physical, mental, and also spiritual. And while you're making that journey towards the enlightenment, you can get the benefit of physical and the mental as well. So psychologically speaking, there are many benefits to be had. Why? Because at the heart of yoga practice really is the training and the discipline of the mind. Besides the training and the discipline of the body and the breath, actually at the heart of yoga practice is the discipline of the mind. In fact, Patanjali defines yoga as cessation of the modifications of the mind. Wow. Now that kind of definition is, people may not be familiar with it. So people think, okay, yeah, I'm going to my yoga class today, and we are going to be practicing this posture, that posture, and we're going to be doing a bit of exercise here in terms of the breathing as well, etc. But really speaking, Patanjali 2,000 years ago was talking about yoga is the cessation of the modifications of the mind. In other words, that yoga will result in a complete quietness in the mind, a silence in the mind. And this, what you mentioned just now, is that within that calmness and silence, that creativity can take place. Okay. And that creativity is simply because you are opening the mind in such a way
Yeah.
through that stillness to a higher dimension of your consciousness.
Mm.
So in this case, yoga does have the benefits in all these different dimensions. Of course, you can practice this as a physical fitness, and that will give you the benefit of physical flexibility, and you whilst you're doing the breathing exercises, it can have an effect on the mind as well, so that you're calming the mind, you're focusing the mind. But really speaking, there are three important things here. One is that it gives meaning to human existence and suffering within this wider context of yoga. Number two, it provides a system of values within which we can function. And number three, it provides a clear basis for choice and action in the world. Now, given this wider framework, it means that it also provides the ways of coping with life and suffering in such a way that we are able to attain the spiritual mental balance. And this is achieved through the training of the mind. And as we know that mental health consists of two things. Mental health means on the one hand, the ability to cope with strains and stresses of life. So that while we are experiencing this continuous change in our life, imagine that 1.5 years ago nobody knew about this COVID, and all of a sudden we are kind of into this kind of lockdown. A huge change, in the humanity throughout the world. How are people coping? Right? Do people have the capacity to cope with this enormous change which has taken place? Even if you don't consider that as as part and parcel, and even after or before the lockdown, people have difficulties in coping with simple things as well as very complex things. So, how do you develop these coping strategies? And that can come through the training of the mind, and the training of the mind can be provided by the yogic techniques, which are very clearly set out. That's number one. Number two is resilience, that people need to have this flexible strength so that even if they're stretched, that kind of stretching the rubber band,
Yeah.
it is going to come back to really its original kind of way of functioning. And even in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, the two things which Bhagavan Shri Krishna mentions is yoga is equanimity of the mind, number one. Yoga is dexterity in action. Now, dexterity in action means that you become proficient at dealing with life and the transactions of life. But at the same time, yoga provides a basis of becoming equanimous in your life. In other words, that you can be thrown about this way and that way by circumstances of life, but you are able to maintain this kind of calmness and presence and this kind of equanimity of the mind, which can deal with anything. This is what is called resilience. So you can see that, within the spiritual tradition of yoga, all these techniques will provide the benefit at all levels. And if we're talking about mental health and mental balance, of course, these two things become important. Coping strategies through mental training and training of the mind, and resilience, which comes through a much deeper sense of, who we are and what we are. And that is also provided by yoga and the spiritual tradition. Why? Because there is a huge mental stigma against mental health. And mental illness is somehow, kind of pushed into the background. And one of the statistics which is very interesting is that 1/3 of the people who suffer from mental illness within our community, they will not approach for any kind of help. Why? Because of the
Wow.
stigma.
That is
So
a
you can
large number.
imagine that out of 100 people, 30 people will keep on suffering. Why? Because they don't want to show anybody or to make it public that they have got this kind of mental health issue, which is a huge figure. So, that is one of the biggest barriers to achieving mental health within our community. And of course, absence of mental health is really very much prevalent now. And I am a practicing counselor as well. And as soon as COVID started, one of the things which really came up and it went through the roof is relationship issues and especially domestic abuse and violence. Not only that, but social isolation, individual isolation, people getting so isolated that that pressure of not being connected, like you mentioned, brings an enormous strain on individuals so that they get into a state of depression. They become so anxious about, is this COVID going to come into my life, into my house, into my body? And this distress, this inability to cope with, these pressures which have been created, leads to the mental illness. And this decreased capacity to regulate the thoughts and the feelings and the behavior, can lead to mental illness like depression. And we know from the statistics also that up to 13 to 15% of the male population and between 23 and 25% of the adult female population have some kind of mental health issue. So you can imagine that 1 in 5 of the community is suffering from mental health issue and is very less likely to seek any kind of help. And there are various different issues which we have noticed that there are huge rise in terms of depression, anxiety, this underlying fear, anxiety about specific things, or a generalized kind of anxiety about all different things, and depression, unhappiness, sadness, helplessness, this difficulty in making decisions, even to start doing things. Some people don't even want to get out of bed. Why? Because they're so depressed. And then you get a mixture of this anxiety and depression. And then, of course, we have seen that there is a lot of loss which has been experienced by people, whether it's specific loss of losing a person, a near and a dear, or losing your job, or losing some kind of, parameters in which we were feeling safe. That has disappeared. And that loss has led to such a kind of grief during this pandemic. And that grief, of course, results in a lot of distress and a lot of suffering. Relationship issues, family relationships have kind of broken down because you're confined within that space. Anger and various different kind of abuse takes place. Marital problems are there. Domestic abuse, as I mentioned. So many things have come together, during this pandemic. But it doesn't mean that it was not there before or it's not going to be there after. These things are going to continue as mental
Heightened,
issues
aren't
in the community.
they?
Yeah.
They're just heightened because we've all been forced to stay together for longer in one space. So, like if you're working from home, then that you might not be exposed to that person for longer hours before, but now you are confined in a space with that one person who you no longer can get away from. You don't have that, and because of this stigma that society places on us, men and women, because men and women face similar difficulties, whether it's domestic violence or abuse, or whether it's depression, anxiety, and I think we need to reflect that men have very similar challenges to women. Just maybe women's issues are highlighted a bit more because it is a bit more commonly seen. And I think that people don't talk about it enough. So then when it gets to that point, it's just bubbled over. And then that's when it becomes a bit more apparent. And the stresses of everything tend to bubble up, right? So they all kind of happens at one go. But I feel like the whole spirituality aspect that we were talking about in yoga during this difficult time could really help us to focus on the future, and the present, actually, more than the
Yeah.
future. To kind of, the art of practicing gratitude paired up with spirituality and yoga, of, saying, I am still here, I am still fit, I am still healthy, I still have my family, and pairing that up with spirituality, in the sense where you are calming yourself, having some quiet time, and maybe practicing that through yoga. So like you were saying, that Patanjali, like, it's to help the mind, right? So if we focus on that a little bit, maybe some techniques that you could talk about that could help, like what could someone try and do,
Sure.
that could maybe help them, and yeah, maybe a couple of things.
Sure. And of course, as I was saying, that Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga consists of the 8 different limbs of yoga, and each one kind of contributes in a holistic way towards the balance in the body, balance in the mind, the integration between the mind and the body. So we can talk about asana, which are the physical posture, which really create this sense of grounding and balance within the body. So that, for example, in depression, the mind takes over, or in anxiety, the mind takes over, and there's a kind of disconnect between the body and the mind. So practicing some of these asanas, simple asanas, doesn't have to be very complicated. And if you can practice those, for about 20 minutes, it can have an enormous effect in terms of the balance in the mind as well as the balance in the body. That's number one. Very simple breathing exercises. We know that there is a connection between the mind and the breath. So, for example, if you get very angry, what happens to the breath? It becomes shallow and it becomes fast. And if you take the opposite of that, that you take in very slow breathing in and slow breathing out, and there are various different ways of practicing these breathing exercises. But even if you take the most simplest one of breathing out and breathing in very slowly and just focusing on the breathing itself, then you will see an immediate effect on the mind. It calms the mind down. It has this sense of peace you begin to experience. And therefore, these simple things like breathing exercises and physical postures can make this to be available to you in terms of dealing with the stresses and strains of life. And of course, the most important one, which I am very much interested in, is the meditative techniques. So, for example, when Patanjali talks about pratyahar is like the ability to take your attention inwards, and you become so kind of aligned to whatever is happening within yourself. And the practice of dharana, which is concentration, the ability to concentrate on something for a long period of time, and contemplation, to begin to think in a specific way, and meditation itself is a complete absorption in an idea or the sense of self or the higher consciousness, whatever it is that you are going to be absorbed in. That has an enormous effect in terms of training the mind to be focused, to be still, to be available to you, to be having this presence of mind in the moment. And when you're able to do that, it gives you an enormous capacity to not only cope with life, but also to be able to have this resilience where you're so centered in this yogic way of being in the world that nothing can shake you. Very little can shake you. So it is important to recognize these things.
You could be on a plane journey, you could be on a flight, and you could decide you want to practice yoga, because it is not all about physical fitness. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's commercialized? Like, do you think that, I mean, I know there are pros and cons to this. Of course, we want as, as a culture, we want to, spread the word about yoga and tell people about yoga and kind of educate them about yoga. But maybe there is less education and more commercialization going on.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for example, the statistics are absolutely phenomenal. In America, in the USA, it is estimated that the yoga industry is 15 billion pounds.
Wow.
Can you imagine 15 billion pounds? Now, yoga, therefore, has now become a commodity. And this is one of the trends which has affected the way in which yoga is becoming so manifest in all communities throughout the world, is that it has become a commodity. And this commodification of yoga is one of the main factors which, based on global capitalism, which means that if I've got something to sell, yes, I'm going to package it in the right way and present it in such a way that, you can buy it, you can kind of have whatever different types of yoga you want. So that is one thing. The other thing is that, many of these spiritual kind of traditions have become so privatized, is that you can believe in something without belonging. Believing without belonging becomes a way in which now you can say, okay, I'm going to practice yoga because, that is my own subjective experience, which I want to have in my life. And I want to have this kind of, feeling in the body, a fitness in the body. And therefore it becomes my private decision as to what I'm going to do. And therefore you become spiritual and you are not religious. Why? Because it's out of the context of organized religion. You don't have to go to the temple. You don't have to go to the church. You don't have to kind of have a set of beliefs. And therefore, this privatization is, in fact, leading you towards spirituality and therefore leading you towards a specific way which you determine yourself. Is that this is tailored to my needs. And therefore, this privatization is another factor in terms of, why this yoga can be seen as becoming so commercialized. The third factor is, of course, globalization, because in this days of the internet, of course, you can access anything in this world, and you don't need to have a guru or a teacher to tell you what to do. You can buy anything on the internet.
It's been really interesting talking to you, Dr. Ramesh. I've had a really great time, and I've learned a lot of things. So thank you a lot for coming on. We're really honoured that you've given us some of your time today.
Well, we need to kind of, acknowledge that, these wisdom traditions have got a lot of value in terms of giving us a sense of balance in our life, a sense of, connectedness, various different mechanisms through which we can cope with life and become so resilient that life becomes a joy. It becomes a joy to live life. And I think that is, for me personally, is the most important thing, is to be able to have joy in life and to enjoy life in such a way that it doesn't kind of take you away from the centeredness which you have through yoga and the practice of yoga. And also, of course, we've been talking about mental health, and then that is again one of the greatest benefits of practicing yoga in whatever form. And of course, whatever is is appropriate for you and convenient for you, do go ahead and practice, and you'll see the difference it makes in your life.
That is a great way to end this conversation. Thank you very much for your time.